Welcome to the Talking the Talk podcast, where we'll be exploring items of automotive technology and their journey into mass production. I'm Kevin Reid, the founder of Ireland Made, where we celebrate stories of Irish transport past and present, and this is our podcast. I'm delighted to welcome my co-host, Automotive Engineering Consultant Mike Keane. Mike's consultancy delivers bespoke and sustainable transport solutions, and previously Mike has led vehicle development programs for Ford, Williams Formula One Advanced Engineering, Nissan, Jaguar, Land Rover, and Aston Martin. Mike has also worked on projects as diverse as hybrid supercars to off-road electric vehicles. But what is most impressive for me, Mike worked on the James Bond movie Spectre, and he worked on the baddies car, the Jaguar CX75. In each episode, we're going to be examining vehicles that range from the 1921 German Rumpler right up to what Tesla and Lucid are doing today.
Hello again. In our first episode, we spoke about aerodynamics, and in this, our second episode of Talking the Talk, we're talking about the origins of automotive styling and how they influenced mass production. Hi, Mike. Good to see you again.
Hi, Kevin. Good to see you too. Yeah, that's right. Last time we talked about aerodynamics, and we occasionally touched on some of the times where aerodynamics and styling crossed over, like detail optimization. But today, then, we're just going to look at styling influences and how that changed over the course of automotive development.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. The first influences. Tell us about those.
Yeah, so the first influences were very much from horse-drawn carriages. So at the point where cars were really first seen on the road, it sort of started in the 1900s. At that stage, horse-drawn carriages had hundreds of years of development and had quite a lot of style gone into them. So as you can imagine, those first cars, they just mimic those styles. We see things like pram-style retractable roofs. We see the plush padded leather seats. The splash guards over the wheels were very like those you would have seen on horse-drawn carriages. The wheels themselves with the wooden spokes, and then lots of metal, lots of polished brass fittings. If you take a car like the 1903 Ford Model A, it's remarkably like a horse-drawn carriage. And the other thing as well is that they were very short. The first cars were very, very short wheelbase, very high, and then again mimicked horse-drawn carriages very early on.
So you were sitting high off the ground to keep you away from the mud on the road and various things like that. So that would have been the start of the styling.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. And then as with all the other technologies, you can think of styling as being a technological development within cars. And as with the other technologies, it was really after World War I that it started to really come into its own. At that stage, so cars were still really commodities owned by the more affluent or the upwardly mobile, but they started to become real status symbols, and so the styling then started to deliberately cultivate images, I should say, that suited the marketing purposes. So they started deliberately making cars that had a sense of desirability or affluence or sex appeal or modernity or muscle. There was all of these things. They start trying to sell this into the car. And as well, at the same time, we see market segmentation happening more and more. So cars were rather than be a one size fits all, you had cars designed for different purposes, and the styling then would tie into that. So two cars at opposite ends of the spectrum, both high value cars, both bought by affluent owners, would have been the Bugatti Type 35, which was designed for racing but was sold on the road, and the Duesenberg Model J, again, which is a luxury touring vehicle. So only affluent owners would have bought those, but they're very different styles at this stage.
Yeah, I'm even thinking the Duesenberg it's like a barge. It's a huge,
absolutely huge.
Yeah. If you need to cross a continent in a day, that's the car you'd go for.
That's right.
So the 20s then saw the style of, do we call them at this stage coach builders? Is that where the phrase begins?
Yeah, we see coach builders come in now. So up until this point, cars were always designed in-house by the car companies. And then we start seeing external companies called coach builders coming in. So these companies would design the bodywork and build bodywork onto the vehicle. And it worked very well because at that point in time, the construction of the vehicle was that the body was bolted onto the chassis. So the chassis was a separate component. So it meant that these companies could take a chassis, in some cases, take off the original bodywork and rebuild and restyle the bodywork on top of these. But by its very nature, it was a limited life span for these companies, because as cars went from having a body on chassis construction into unibody and into monocoque, suddenly that ability to be able to separate the body design from the chassis was deleted. And today we still have coach building, but we tend to see it in buses and coaches, right? So if you think of the body of the coach on the chassis.
Right. So clear reference to the horse-drawn days. And then moving on, then that led us up to around, I suppose, the 1920s to much smaller cars. So take us through that. Yeah, up until that point, cars were owned by the affluent, and we start seeing cars designed and deliberately sold towards people with less wealth. They tended to be smaller cars. And then sort of post the Great Depression in particular, there's a rejection of the opulence that happened in the 1920s. And that's mimicked in the cars. Cars like in the United States, the Ford Model A, or in Europe, the Austin 7, they're very simply designed, very simply styled. It's a rejection of the opulence, but it's also just a functional thing. So they were much cheaper to make, right? And they had to be cheaper to make in order to meet those lower costs, those sale prices. Through the 30s, then there isn't that much development really. Sorry, through the late 30s into the 40s, there isn't that much development because the war stopped production for most car companies. And we see that after the war, then they kind of picked up where they left off. Yeah. So the styling really kicked off in the 50s, and immediately I'm thinking of big fins in American cars. Should I be thinking of anything else? Yeah. So for me, there's two words in the 50s, two unrelated words that I always think of: bass and Italians. And that for me, that defines sort of where styling started to go in the 1950s. If we look at space, so you rightly say, so the big fins that we see at the back, the space race, you can think about Sputnik launching in 57, but actually the aesthetic of space was happening all through the 50s. It was a very popular topic in popular fiction and modern in popular culture, and it was definitely influencing car design, particularly in the United States. So we start seeing these big fins, as you see at the back. We see lights at the rear that look like the jet stream from exhaust. We see sort of these protrusions at the front that look a little bit like the front of a torpedo on the bumper. And then the other thing we see is a lot of glass. So there was a kind of an idea of, in space you have these large glass housed spaceships. And if you look at a car like the Cadillac Coupe de Ville, it's a huge car. There's a lot of real estate there, and it's absolutely festooned with sort of all of these features here. Yeah, so it bred every childhood that your parents' car reminded you your little spaceship you're playing and all of that. Excellent. Yes, exactly. So a separation then that obviously I'm answering my own question, the design styles between the US and Europe, very separate. Yeah, through the 50s, we start to see that separation more and more. There is some commonality and there is some crossover, particularly for American car companies that had a subsidiary or a sub-brand in Europe. Yep. So if you think of Ford, so Ford obviously, have subsidiaries all around the world. And cars like in the 50s, the Ford Zephyr or the Anglia, they very much mimic the 1950s Fords coming out of the States. And again, Vauxhall, so a British brand, it's a sub-brand of General Motors. And in the 1950s, their cars like the Cresta and the Velox, there's really obvious influences from the United States. Often the features are there, like the space features are there, but they're a lot more subdued on the European cars. So they're toned down somewhat. Yeah, that's right. Okay. Now, interestingly for me, US style, as I understand it, also heavily influenced Australian cars, so the whole way around the world. Yeah, again, and for similar reasons, actually, Kevin. So again, if you think of the two big manufacturers in Australia, Holden and Ford, both actually American-owned companies. So although actually technically
Ford of Australia is owned by Ford of Canada. That's an aside. Yeah.
As Michael Keane would say, not a lot of people know that.
That's right. Yeah, it's a slightly odd arrangement. But so Holden, a General Motors company, initially they started just doing what were called knockdown kits. So cars were built, they were assembled in Australia, having been shipped over. And in the 1950s, they started producing their own designs. And Ford started doing the same a little bit later, sort of towards the late 50s into the early 60s. But the influence is very clearly coming from the US. And you can see real sort of family resemblances throughout these companies. So within the GM family, within the General Motors family, if you take the late 60s, you've got something like the Holden Monaro GTS, the Chevrolet Nova Coupe, and in Germany, the Opel Commodore Coupe. And if you put those cars side by side, there's a real clear family resemblance across all those cars. Yeah. I quite like actually when you see it, an individual feature has migrated across. So
can you give an example?
Yeah, right. So stick with General Motors. It's one of my favorites. I think because I always like the cars in Europe. But the 1960s and 70s Chevrolet, so the Corvair, the Corvette, the Impala, one of their design features was that the rear lights were individual round lights mounted side by side on the rear tail panel. Okay. Yeah. And that exact same feature then was used on a number of Opels in the late 70s or early 70s. So the Manta and the GT most obviously. And I love that because it's just this one small design feature that's migrated across.
Oh yeah. Thank you for educating me. Now educate me further because you've taken us through the science. Now take us through the Italians.
Yeah, right. So why did I say Italians? So we talked a moment ago about the coach builders and sort of the external companies doing that work. And then through the 40s, that had really gone back in-house. Now, car companies around the world, they have their own internal design teams. But what we start to see in the 1950s is the growth and really the prominence of design houses that are external to the car companies and really all from Italy. Italy absolutely led the way on this from the 50s through to the 1980s. Myriad companies like Zagato, Pininfarina, Bertone, Guilia, Tal Design, Vignale, all operating out of northern Italy, usually around the Turin area. And they became, almost as famous as the car companies themselves.
It's interesting you say some of those names because as a young fella, I always thought that, like when I heard Zagato, it was part of the brand. Like that was Aston Martin. They did a lot of Aston Martins.
That's right. Yeah.
I just thought that I didn't realize they were a separate coach builder until I came into my teens. Now, was it only Italian car companies that utilized?
No. So you've just said Aston Martin, right? So it's a really good example, right? So they were obviously linked to the car companies, so Fiat, Ferrari, Lancia. They had strong links in all those, but they operated globally, particularly in Europe. The design company that was most readily associated with non-Italian car companies is probably Pininfarina or Farina, as it was known up to 61. So if you take the British Motor Corporation, so BMC in the 1960s, nearly all of their range of cars was designed by Farina, to the extent where so if you take one model, the Austin A55 Cambridge, that was often referred to as the A55 Farina to separate it from the previous in-house design.
Right. So for the purposes of what we're here today, you're going to have to describe the styling influences of that style.
Yeah, right. So 1950s, very roundy shapes, right? So think of in Europe, Morris Minors, Volkswagen Beetles. In the 1960s, then, Farina probably led the way with a much sleeker design. So not quite straight lines, but very, very shallow curves, so almost to the point where people would think of them as straight lines. Single continuous lines running from the headlight all the way to the tail on the side of the car. We have those tail fins we talked about earlier on, and what you often get is a very slight up sweep on the tail fin and a very slight down sweep on a midline that runs along the waist. And that sort of gives this impression of motion, of moving forward. So if you look at these cars from the side, 3-box design, but there's a very strong sense of moving forward. So they were very much about sort of modern 1960s, moving away from 1950s conservative design. And then what would often happen is companies would sell the design to design companies would sell the design to multiple car companies who are unrelated. So a moment ago, I talked about General Motors with the Holden and the Chevy and the Opel Commodore. Now they're all within the one family, and they look familiar, so you can understand that. But if you take again Farina, so they would have sold that Farina design to, if you take a car like the Austin A55 that I mentioned, or the Morris Oxford from the BMC family, if you look at the Peugeot 404, or you look at the Lancia Fulvia, completely different companies, no link with the car company, but actually those cars look very similar, and that's because Farina have sold that same design multiple times to those car companies.
The design cues stretch across. Very good. So educate me then. Did car companies not have their internal teams for doing all of this? Why go external?
They did have internal teams. It gives you it gives you an idea of just the regard that these external teams were held in, because when they were tendering for contracts, they were often in competition with an internal design team. So what would typically happen? So there's sort of two approaches to how these design companies worked. One was that they would tender for a contract. They were asked by the car company to tender for a contract. The other is that they would create their own version of the car. So they take a production car and they would create a concept and they would offer it back to the car company. So one of the things that came out of that then is there's quite a lot of concept cars were created in the 60s, 70s, 80s that never made production. So these were concept cars, the design houses created, offered to the car company, but they weren't actually used.
All right. So give us an example.
The Lancia Fulvia, one of my favorite cars, actually. So the Lancia Fulvia Coupe was designed in-house. Beautiful, really pretty little car. At the same time as it had been designed in-house and it went to production with its in-house design, Lancia asked Zagato, would they create another design that was that had improved aerodynamics and was a little bit sportier. So Lancia then took the chassis, took the underpinnings of the Fulvia, and they created a car that on the outside is quite different to the standard Fulvia Coupe. It's very typical of what Ercole Spada was doing at Zagato at the time. And that car then was created in a smaller production number and was sold by Lancia in parallel to the production company and sold as the sport model. Spada was chief designer at Zagato. You can kind of you mentioned the Aston Martin DBs. So you can always recognize Zagato's style. So they tend to be uncluttered. So they tend to remove a lot of the body trim. And the other thing I always think you can recognize as Zagato style is the features around the headlights are always very heavy. So often the headlights become set back into the bodywork and they're cowled over. So really, really stands out. And if I can just actually hold on to the Fulvia for a moment.
Okay.
You remember in the last conversation, Kevin, we talked about the camback effect in aerodynamics. So that's where you have this very vertical cut off of the rear. And it was in aerodynamics associated with the teardrop shape. What you start seeing then is designers start using the vertical cutoff, that design style, even if they're not actually incorporating the teardrop shape. And the Fulvia is a really good example of that. So it doesn't have a teardrop type coupe, but has a very, very sharp camback at the rear. And you see this, you see it happen over and over again in cars that are really quite a long way away from the teardrop design. So the Triumph range, pretty much every Triumph from the 1960s on has it. So the Herald, the Dolomite, 2000, you see this very sharp cut off vertical rear panel. And all of those Triumphs were actually all designed by Giovanni Michelotti, again, another Italian designer.
All right. So you've mentioned Giovanni Michelotti and Ercole Spada. Are the designers as well known as a design house? Do the names flow out?
Yeah, they do. So in the earlier days of engineering cars, the chief engineer's name was often well known. So people like Alec Siganis, very well known in BMC, designed the Mini, designed the Morris Minor. By the 60s, the complexity of car design, the multidisciplinary approach of car design meant that the chief engineer was far less well known.
Yeah.
But actually not so in styling. So in the styling houses, whether it's internal or external, the name of the chief designer is actually very well known. And I think it kind of comes around because in design houses, there's still very much a sort of a master apprentice type approach, where, the opinion of the chief designer is paramount. The chief designer often sets the core design going, the core development going. And also because there are technical principles, but it's also a subjective, it's a creative subjective approach as well. So it's very much an approach whereby that master designer, that chief designer, has learned their trade, has proven their trade, and therefore their name becomes quite well known.
Okay, so could you quickly take us through the names that are famous?
Lots of Italians. So Accoli, Spada, Leonardo Fioravanti, who designed a lot of well-known Ferraris in the 80s, Giovanni Michelotti. In more recent days, designs have tended to come back in-house, sort of from the 90s, from the 80s, 90s onwards. And now we start seeing chief designers who were internal start coming to the fore. So Shiro Nakamura in Nissan, Frank Stevenson, Ian Callum, Chris Bangle. So all these names are very well known in automotive design. Probably the name that's arguably the most famous of all is Giorgetto Giugiaro. He had a remarkable career. He designed for Bertone, for Guilia, and for Ital Design. So Ital Design was a company that he co-founded himself. He's got over 150 cars, credited to him, and some of the most prominent cars and some of the most iconic designs all to him. So the Alfa Romeo Giulia from the 60s, the Mark I Golf, the Mark I Sirocco we spoke about in the aerodynamics conversation, Fiat Panda, DeLorean, Lotus Esprit, can keep going. Just a remarkable career. Designed motorbikes as well. Designed cameras for Nikon, in fact.
All right. Well, I'm admiring him already because of the DeLorean. Interestingly, that he designed cameras. So very quickly, what were the other influences for designs that he came up with outside of cars?
Yeah. So that's a good point. So if you think of so design is a subjective approach. So all designers, it doesn't matter what area they are in, they are looking at influences from all around them. They're looking at areas from other design principles.
Yeah.
And one area that we see in cars, not very prominent, but we can pick it out, is the German Bauhaus design. So Bauhaus is an architectural approach. Actually, started in the 1930s. The principle of Bauhaus is that the form follows the function, so that the design has a minimal input. There's as little input in the design as possible. And Butzi Porsche was the grandson of Ferdinand Porsche, who founded the Porsche company. He had been a student of the Ulm School of Design in Germany, where he studied the Bauhaus principle, and he designed the original 911. So if you think of that original 911, very, very pure lines, very, very simple lines. And again, Audi referenced the Bauhaus principle for the TT and for the remarkable A2. I say remarkable because it's a car people often forget about, and it's remarkable for many reasons, styling, construction materials. But so Audi referenced Bauhaus in those cars as well.
So we're in the 90s, we're getting closer to today. What are we starting to see? Yeah,
big thing we see is retro design. I think the car that kicked it off for me is the Mazda MX-5 or Miata or Unos, depends on which jurisdiction it was sold in. So Mazda took design lead, massively took design lead from the 1960s Lotus Elan, and they did a really good job. I mean, it's a beautifully proportioned car. It's retro, but it's not kitsch, and you can tell that by the fact that if you look at a Mark I MX-5 today, it still looks good and it looks right for the 1990s. It certainly helped that, it's one of the best handling cars ever as well.
Mm-hmm.
So that was Mazda looking back to Lotus, looking to another company. What started to happen then is car companies started to look back into their own back catalogue and started to think, well, they could reproduce iconic cars or iconic designs, do a modern interpretation, a modern retro interpretation of them, and release another version of them.
So I'm thinking immediately the Beetle, the new Beetle, Fiat 500, the
Yeah,
Mini.
exactly. Perfect. Yeah, in fact, actually, they're the perfect tree, Kev. That for me, they really are the cornerstones of this design principle. So, the new Mini, the Beetle, and the 500. So interestingly, actually, the Mini and the Fiat 500 were both designed by Frank Stevenson. So, that's quite an achievement to be able to say in terms of his influence on design. And the 500 it's a very good example of how good design can not only influence the car, but can actually change the fortunes of the company. So the Fiat 500 came out in 2007. By the mid 2000s, Fiat were not in a great place. Market share was something like 5% in Europe. The product range was not great. It wasn't a very strong range. They needed something that was going to refresh that line. They needed a new product, but they didn't have much development funding for it. So Stevenson and his team took the platform that the Panda was on, which is a pretty utilitarian car, and that's what they used to develop the 500 design on it. And they launched the 500 in 2007, and within 2 years, Fiat's European market share had doubled just based on that car alone.
On that car alone, my goodness. So you're taking us through, you mentioned named up like Frank Stevenson, who designed the Mini and the Fiat 500. What is the importance of the designer?
The designers, and this is where this master apprenticeship, and you can see the importance of designer coming in. So if you have a designer whose principles are liked and is able to push designs into new places so that the buying public likes them but hasn't seen them before, then they can really achieve some really good stuff. If you think about Ian Callum, I mentioned a few moments ago. So Ian is arguably one of the best known designers that's currently active. Started at Ford, went to Aston Martin where he designed the DP7, then became director of design at Jaguar cars. Interestingly, actually, he double jobbed for a while on Aston Martin and Jaguar, but then he became sort of, let's say, full-time design director at Jaguar. And in sort of when he joined Jaguar, at that point, Jaguar were stuck with a bit of an old-fashioned, conservative, stodgy image, selling to an older clientele, and sort of they were trying to break out of that. And old-fashioned, not retro, right? There's a difference, right? Sort of not cool.
Yeah.
Callum took that. He took that design. He very much reinvigorated the whole of design principle for what Jaguar were doing. He started to make designs that were cool, that were sort of muscular, much more modern, and pitched the company at a much younger clientele. And it really started to change the fortunes of the Jaguar cars company.
And he designed the Jaguar CX75, which you worked on.
That's right, he did. The CX75 was designed just originally as a concept car. It was shown at Paris, the 2010 motor show. It got such a good reception that Jaguar decided they would go to production with it, and they asked Williams Advanced Engineering to partner up on the development of that. I was a propulsion system lead engineer on the first prototype, and then I was lead designer on the second prototype phase. Jaguar decided that they wouldn't go as far as production with the car while it was in a prototype build phase. But then 2 years later, Eon Productions partnered with Jaguar Land Rover for JLR to supply a number of the supporting vehicles for the James Bond movie Spectre. And they chose the CX75 as the villain's car in that. So whereas the first car was a carbon fiber monocoque hypercar, Jaguar then asked Williams would they redesign that car so on the exterior it looks the same, but it's a stunt car. It's it's able to drive down the steps of the Traviata fountain and drop itself into the river in Rome. Right?
but do it in a very, very cool way.
In a very cool way.
So the CX75 was a petrol electric hybrid. What effect has the move to electric vehicles made on styling? Because this is a whole different way of looking at things.
Yeah, that's right. You remember when we talked about aerodynamics, we talked about that synergy between the need to reduce resistance, so aerodynamic resistance, and the styling. So one of the obvious things we see is sort of the front of the car. I think everyone would recognize that electric vehicles, there's a different front on an electric vehicle. Yeah, there's a closed-in grille, and that's because of that reduced need for heat rejection, so therefore reduced need for a grille opening, but also that needs to reduce aerodynamic resistance tends to create very uncluttered designs. Very simple, sleek and stylish, but very simple designs.
And I'm thinking immediately of Tesla. I think the Model 3, good example of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So the Tesla, I think what Tesla did very well is that they bridged the gap from where the designs of petrol engine cars were at the time into EV, and they made the design sort of acceptable to the public. So they created these stylish designs, not revolutionary, but I don't mean that in a negative way. I just mean, they were a natural stepping stone. They weren't seen as being very unusual. In fact, Franz von Holzhausen is the chief designer of Tesla. He had been the chief designer of Mazda. I always think that if you look at the Model S and you look at the Mazda 6, I think you can see a lot of design cues between those. So it was just a very good job of sort of bridging that, bridging across from one to the other.
And the fact that the public accepted it, because in episode 1, we were talking about how the public didn't accept the Sierra. In fact, certain people thought it was a jelly mold and it was too much of an advance. So what you're saying is these designers have made the jump acceptable to the public.
Yeah, and I think, you talked earlier on about, the role or the importance of the designer. So that's really what the designer is doing, right? So if you think the designer is always trying to push the design into a place that the public has not seen before, right? Because it's trying to create something new to draw in the public. But, knowing how far you can push that is the key, right? And I think probably the Sierra is a little bit too far.
So just taking this further, then, electric motors are smaller than petrol engines. How has this changed design? Because you have more space to play with.
Yeah, right. So the platform is different now in an electric car to a petrol car. So you see some electric cars out there that have been designed for a common platform. So the likes of the Golf, the likes of Hyundai's first version of the Ioniq. When the car is then designed specifically for an electric platform, we start seeing, more significant design changes coming through. The volume of the electric motors is smaller than the volume of the engine. So that means there's a lot more space at the front of the vehicle. But at the same time, the batteries are usually packaged in the floor of the vehicle, which raises the seat, raises what's called the H point or the hip point, raises it, and then raises the roofline. And if you look at a car like the Jaguar I-Pace, again, an Ian Callum design, you look at a side profile like that, the cab is very far forward, right? So the windscreen line, the occupant area is very far forward in the cab. And the roofline is a little bit higher than you would expect normally. So we're starting to see these designs specifically for the EV platform, but they've got their own influences that the EV platform is putting onto the exterior design.
Yeah, so very basically put, without the engine, the passengers can sit further forward. You can have a smaller, essentially, engine area or electronic.
Yeah, that's right.
Very good.
Yeah.
So they've started a trend, and we can see that in many other vehicles now.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, if you look at companies like Kia and Hyundai, I think electric cars and the design of electric cars has really transformed those companies. So you take the likes of the latest Ioniq 5. It's right at the forefront of design, and it's right up there with legacy players like Volkswagen or new players like Tesla and Lucid. And all of these cars, they're all creating cars now that are designed for EV, designed in conjunction with the EV platform, not trying to carry over an IC variant of the platform as well. And these new designs are very modern, very stylish. And I think they're starting to make the IC cars almost look a little bit dated.
Now, when you say IC for the general public, that means
internal combustion.
Combustion. You can't get rid of the engineer in you. That's
No.
fair.
Thanks for picking up. It's the engineer's jargon. Right?
Engineer's jargon. Very interesting, Mike. Thank you so much for today. Hope you enjoyed that, folks. So that was styling. We've covered aerodynamics. Now we've covered styling today. In our next episode, we're going to cover cooling.
Thank you for joining us today on the Talking the Talk podcast. My thanks to Mike Keane, and you can check out his consultancy on mikekeane.ie. Then check out irelandmade.ie to view our back catalogue of videos celebrating stories of Irish transport, past and present. We look forward to welcoming you onto our next episode where we further explore the origins of automotive technology. You can find us on YouTube or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Please subscribe and tell your friends. Bye for now.